right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. My name is Greg Patchel, and I'm going to be giving a presentation on teaching ADM and risk management in a AATD or a flight simulator. I just wanted to thank Redbird for giving me a chance to present this year and for their commitment to flight training. I've attended the past 4 conferences and enjoyed a lot of the interaction between instructors and presenters. This year is going to be a little different, obviously, but hopefully it'll be just as educational and as enjoyable. So with that, I'll go ahead and start my presentation. A little bit about myself. I'm the Director of Aeronautics and the Chief Flight Instructor here at Gateway Technical College in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I'm a CFI, II, MEI, ATP, bunch of letters on my certificate there, but my background, some instructing in light sport, private, instrument, commercial, both multi-engine and single engine, and some CFI students as well. I also served with the Civil Air Patrol in Wisconsin as a check pilot and as an assistant standardization and evaluation officer. And some recognition from AOPA Flight Training Experience Awards the last couple of years. I highly suggest that the CFIs that are watching this get involved with that. It's a great way to get out there and make yourself known a little bit better. As a chief flight instructor, a lot of times I don't get to go out and fly for fun much, but this was a shot back this past August in our Seminole out over the Grand Canyon. So I got to go out there for a little bit and get some flighting over some nice terrain and some beautiful vistas. And if you're going to take a trip like that, you can't go alone, right? So I had to bring my daughter along with me. That's Gabby. She's 13, so she's enjoying the ride as well, all ready to go there with her sunglasses. So you launch on a great trip like this, headed out west. Everything's nice and relaxing, great views, and it kind of lulls you into a sense of complacency. So that's Gabby's somewhere between Wisconsin and Arizona here, just kind of relaxing and taking it all in. And everything's going well, and then things start to go not so well. So visibility starts dropping. You can see I got a layer of clouds over me. Start checking weather here, and what do we see? Well, there's some storms out there, some scattered storms between myself and Flagstaff, my destination. And I'm still about 170 miles away from Flagstaff here. So look at ForeFlight, kind of decide what I'm going to do here, and I'm going to try to deviate around these cells to the south, maybe make a stop and get some fuel or whatnot, but hopefully still be able to make the mission work, right? I want to try to get to Flagstaff before sunset. And we're still able to fly over the meteor crater over by Winslow. Granted, the visibility is not as good as I wanted, but still able to make the mission work and see a couple of the sites on the way out to Sedona and Flagstaff. This is breaking out of some of the storms and seeing the sunset and Flagstaff kind of out in the distance. And somewhere out there is an airport that we landed at, but we were able to make it down to the ground. So traveling, halfway across the country or maybe a little bit more, a lot of decisions to be made en route, obviously. So let's talk a little bit about some ADM. Why do we want to teach ADM? Well, there's lots of examples out there, and I'm just going to kind of hurriedly go through a couple here. Everyone can kind of see that one from LA. We know what accident that is. Talk a little bit about the accidents by phases of flight. From the null report, obviously, takeoff and landing are some of the most stressful times. We see the numbers of accidents going up there. And maneuvering is high on the fatality list. Obviously, loss of control. So what are we doing to try to curb this? What are we doing to try to make it change? Well, we've got risk management, we've got safety management systems, and if you look at the definition there from 2013, ICAO says it's a systematic approach to managing safety, including the necessary organizational structures, accountabilities, policies, and procedures. That sounds like something maybe a business would use, but not me as a pilot. Well, keep in mind, you can be your own organization, right? So what about personal minimums? Do you have personal minimums? What type of procedures do you use while you're flying? Those kind of things that organizations use, or corporate flight departments and airlines, we can adopt those same type of procedures and policies ourselves. Talk a little bit about loss of control, and that's always a big buzzword, right? So loss of control, if we look at the definition, involves an unintended departure of an aircraft from controlled flight. It can happen either because the aircraft enters a flight regime that is outside its normal flight envelope and may quickly develop into a stall or spin, and it can introduce an element of surprise to the pilot. Well, that kind of goes without saying if you're going to lose control, right? So let's look at some of the factors that the FAA has talked about that contribute to loss of control situations. So there's a good list of them there. There's poor judgment, aeronautical decision-making was the first one they talked about. Failure to recognize an aerodynamic stall or spin and execute corrective action. Intentional regulatory non-compliance, so we're talking hazardous attitudes here, right? Low pilot time in an aircraft make and model, so not being familiar with the aircraft you're flying. Lack of pilot ability. Failure to maintain airspeed. Failure to follow procedure, and the list goes on. Inexperience, proficiency, and use of the over-counter drugs that could impact your performance. So I kind of looked at this list that the FAA puts out there, and I said, well, which one of these are stick and rudder skills that really need to be taught, and which of them are brain-trained skills or decision-making skills that hopefully we can improve? So what I did is I kind of color-coded them here. The red ones are ones that I thought, in my opinion, were weak aeronautical decision-making skills. So poor judgment, ADM, that goes without saying. Intentional regulatory non-compliance, those are bad decisions, right? Failure to follow procedures and use of medications, those are all bad decisions. The ones in blue are weak stick and rudder skills. These are ones we can train in the airplane. Failure to recognize aerodynamic stall or spin, that's right there in the ACS that we're supposed to train that, right? Lack of piloting ability, how do we get better ability? We have to practice that. Failure to maintain airspeed leading to a loss of control, obviously that we can learn in the airplane. And then ones in orange or yellow here, these are ones that could maybe live in both realms, both stick and rudder skills and decision-making skills. Low pilot time in an aircraft, pilot inexperience and proficiency. FAA's take on loss of control, what we can simulate. So they want us to think about abnormal events ahead of time, practice our plan. Brief your plan prior to takeoff, even when flying solo. So a good example of this would be before takeoff briefing. We train our students here at the college to give a before takeoff briefing on what would happen if the engine were actually to fail, on the runway, about 500 feet off the ground, and then on the climb out to cruise. Have a certified flight instructor join you and train and plan for emergencies. Sounds like a great idea. Review emergency procedures for your aircraft on a regular basis and not waiting until you need a flight review. So every 2 years flight review, that's when we hopefully crack open the POH and go through some of those procedures. But yeah, maybe we should do that a little more often, right? Another one is sitting in your airplane and kind of going through flow checks, touching the controls and visualizing your airplane's cockpit. Maybe you've even heard of doing this blindfolded so you learn where those controls are in an emergency, right? Reviewing and practicing what-if scenarios. Vocalizing takeoff approach, landing expectations, configurations. So these are different types of call-outs you'll see the airlines making. Corporate flight departments, again, we could adopt those same procedures. And then the Wings Proficiency Program is a great way to get some training in as well. So how else can we make this more tactile and more impactful to the students? Well, if we look at loss of control accidents and we look at that ADM that we talked about, maybe we're actually losing control before we even start the engine. Maybe those bad decisions are made before we even get in the airplane through lack of planning or poor decision making. So I'm going to go through a couple quick accidents here. We'll take a look at them just for a little bit, and then I'll kind of show you what we do as a school here to try to train some better decision making. So the first accident is going to be a takeoff accident. You can see there's some of the events, loss of control in flight, collision on ground, collision with terrain, and a landing gear collapse. So let's take a look at the pilot and the weather conditions. Single engine private, 55-year-old pilot, non-instrument rated. I have a decent amount of time here, 1,064 hours, 823 in make and model, and 57 hours in the last 90 days. So pretty proficient, it looks like. Weather was daytime, VFR, visibility 10 plus miles, clear skies. The wind is screaming at 3 knots, and the temperature is 21 degrees. So what could go wrong here? Well, the probable cause to this accident was the pilot's improper performance planning and their pre-flight planning for a high-density altitude airport that took off from a dirt airstrip and resulted in impact for terrain. So some notes from the NTSB report here. The pilot reported before takeoff from a 1,700-foot airstrip at a 9,200-foot density altitude. He set the flaps to 20, held the brakes, ran the engine up to full power. And after the accident, while being interviewed, he said he just seemed like the takeoff roll seemed longer and slower than usual. Yeah, maybe someone didn't quite do the pre-flight planning they needed to do to see what that takeoff distance was going to be under that high density altitude and from a dirt airstrip. So the shortcuts we're used to using maybe don't work in all cases. Take another look at an accident here. This is a landing accident on runway 22 right. Looks like a diamond there. Pilot is 27-year-old pilot, private pilot rated, non-instrument. 187 hours of total time. 187 hours in make and model, and 44 hours in the last 90 days. So not too bad there, an hour every other day. That's probably, maybe more than I'm even flying. Weather, it's daytime, visibility is 10 plus miles, clear skies, winds are screaming at 6 knots here, and temperature is 29 degrees Celsius. The cause of this one was determined to be a loss of directional control, either not attained or maintained. What was happening here is the pilot was practicing takeoffs and landings and doing touch and goes. But he had been cleared to land, and he wasn't quite sure if he should do a touch and go or if he should do a full stop landing. So he initiated a aborted takeoff too late down the runway and ended up losing control of the aircraft. Accident number 3 is going to be controlled flight into terrain. Take a look at the pilots, lots of experience here. So both are ATP rated, single engine, multi-engine, helicopter ratings, glide air, seaplane, lots of experience here. Pilot is 71 years old with a first class medical, 28,000 hours, 187 hours in make and model, 44 hours in the last 90 days, and he had factory G1000 training. This was when the G1000 was first starting to come out in Cessnas. The non-flying pilot that we believe was non-flying, ATP rated, same thing here, 73 years old, first class medical, lots of time there, 25,000 hours. Not quite sure how much he had in make and model and in the last 90 days, but we did know that he did not have any G1000 training. Conditions of the flight. Oh, it occurred at night. Visibility was better than 10 miles, few clouds at 11,000 feet. Winds were 240 at 3, and the temperature was 23 degrees. This accident occurred out in the Las Vegas area, and maybe some of you know about the accident, but it was for the Civil Air Patrol, and they had just purchased a couple of these G1000 equipped aircraft, and what a lot of people think happened is they got the autopilot on, were flying the airplane, and starting to do some training on the G1000, and maybe didn't quite confirm that the airplane was climbing or not with the autopilot and impacted terrain on a almost cloudless night. So definitely some examples here where people could have made better decisions possibly, and the outcomes could have been better. How can we train pilots to make the right decisions? I think all of us as instructors kind of ask that of ourselves a lot. So current methods right now that we're using, VMC, IMC clubs, those are great for talking about different scenarios. Flight reviews, but I mean, let's face it, that's only once every 2 years that we get to touch base with a pilot. and likely they want to keep it to a minimum of time, maybe an hour. You know, that's what they're pushing for. What's the least I have to do to be able to get that flight review? So sometimes there's not a lot of chance to be able to go into in-depth training on something like that. The ACS outlines a lot of risk management tools that we can utilize as instructors and as students. Different podcasts like AOPA Never Again, hopefully we can learn from others' mistakes. And in the same manner, hangar stories and sharing our experiences and our mistakes and how we, I guess, survive those mistakes, right? One of the things our school looked at doing was trying to develop an immersive simulation method. So how are we actually going to simulate these type of scenarios and get students to react, maybe get startled and whatnot, and try to simulate as close to a real life emergency as we could. So we had to make it realistic, because if you're not going to make a realistic scenario, that the students really aren't going to buy in, right? So sitting in a simulator, just failing every instrument one after another, how likely is that to happen? So it's got to be realistic. It's got to have realistic pressures. There's got to be reasons to do the mission. Realistic failures and conflicts, like I talked about there. And then we took it one step further and based all of these accidents on real NTSB reports. So there's a scenario that really happened to someone, and there's a report on it. Take a look at the students that we normally put through this course. They already have their private pilot certificate and their instrument rated. They've got about 10 hours in a Piper Seminole in their logbook already. At this point, they're probably working on their cross-country time building courses. So it's kind of a great way to segue into decision-making away from your home airport. So how can we train pilots to make the right decision? Well, in our course, we've got a pre-flight component, and then we've got some homework that the pilot has to do before they show up for the simulation. So the instructor will provide the student with a briefing. The briefing will include the mission. So why are we flying? The aircraft to be used, destination, weather forecast and route, and any passengers or cargo that we're going to be carrying. We might also include maybe some other inoperative equipment that was found or something like that, just to see how they respond to that as well. What's the pilot got to do before they show up? Well, we expect them to give us a flight plan form and have their fuel request kind of noted in the flight plan as well. So we know how to set up the simulator. That way I know kind of what route they're planning, what altitude they want to fly, and I can kind of tailor the scenario to that. We also require them to do a one-page risk management paper. Now, again, we're a college, but this is something that could be tweaked a little bit for the private flight instructor that's not in a college setting, obviously. So the paper, we want them to go through and identify the risks that they see in this scenario, and then any negation strategies that they might be employing to try to lower those risks. So here's an example from the FAA, the Risk Management Handbook, on a assessment and mitigation worksheet. So you can see off to the left side here, we've got pre-mitigation hazards and likelihood and severity of outcome. And then we've got some mitigation strategies, and then we can go on and see how that has affected that risk that we perceive. There's other tools out there as well. Here's a FRAT tool, so Flight Risk Assessment Tool. This is just a part of a spreadsheet that someone had, and this goes into the pilot. So your I'm safe checklist, fatigue, down towards the bottom, they're talking about last flight and make and model, so currency there. You could develop your own, and this is where we kind of take the paved checklist, obviously, the I'm safe checklist, your 5 Ps, the plane, the pilot, passengers, the plan, the programming, and kind of delve into those and see what's really there, what's likely to either make it unsuccessful for us to complete the mission or really cause some hazards or risks as we're flying. So let's take a look at one of the scenarios that we might present to our students. So we're going to make a VFR day flight in Florida, and we can pick an airport that we're going to leave and another airport we're going to go to, or a town we're going to visit. In this scenario, it's 95 degrees out. We're going to be bringing one adult passenger and two children. The scenario last time I ran it, I said, well, it's your sister and maybe some cousins. And why are we flying? And what's the weather? So the weather, it looks like a beautiful day to fly. Winds are pretty much negligible. High pressure dominates the region. So not a lot of worries for rain or anything like that, or poor weather. The mission, it's a first flight for 10 and 8-year-old cousins, and they're going to fly to visit family about 150 miles away. And the student would be expected to kind of choose the best airport. I'll tell them what city that we need to get to, and they can kind of figure out where they want to have the family meet us. So now what does the instructor have to do to actually make this scenario work? Well, it's like I said, it's based off an NTSB report and findings. So we need to apply that realistically to the scenario. I highly suggest creating a script to provide realistic flight following, IFR flight plan services, weather, frequency handoffs, that type of thing, so that you're not sitting there stumbling through it as you're doing the scenario. So have a script that you can work off of with frequency numbers and services, and maybe even changeover points where you're going to get handed off from one center to an approach, or vice versa. I like to utilize live ATC in the background to simulate radio traffic. That way, if I'm going to simulate a radio failure or comms failure, I just turn off live ATC, and all of a sudden they're not able to hear anything. So that might be a clue that things aren't working. Also, be prepared for the trigger event, whatever that cause that NTSB report, whether it be an equipment failure, weather, whatever it is. Be prepared for that when you're going to cause that in the simulated flight, and the student's possible choices or how they might react. So you can't guess, I guess, every possible outcome that the student might choose, but try to think what's out there and be prepared for that. So have a script ready with diversion airports, different types of weather at those airports, written down so you could read it off if they quickly tune in a ATIS or a METAR, and try to get that information. And try to act as much as you can like ATC. So ATC might actually give you some distractions. They might be asking, if you're declaring an emergency, how much fuel's on board, how many people are on board. Those are things that maybe the student isn't ready to handle and might cause them to lose some of their concentration. So I try to make it as realistic as I can when I'm doing these presentations. So let's take a look a little bit here at a scenario trigger. This is one of the scenarios that I presented in a Redbird flight simulator. So you can see definitely something going on inside the simulator there. This was that scenario of a flight down to Florida, and in the scenario, there was an engine fire en route. Being 95 degrees, we had the windows open, we had some air vents open. So obviously some of that smoke is going to come into the flight deck and the passenger cabin of the Cessna 172 that we were flying in or simulating. So how did I make that more realistic? I ran out to Party City, a Halloween store, and I bought a smoke generator. So maybe spending $40 on a small smoke generator. Here it makes it very realistic for the students that were in the flight. So at this point, we'll see if we can get a video of the scenario to play. I'm not sure if the sound's going to work, but I can kind of narrate what's happening here. So we're about maybe an hour into the flight, hour and a half. You can see they're pretty relaxed at this point. And we're just cruising along. I think we're at about 6,500 feet, maybe 55, depending on direction. And I'm going to put an iPad in here with a visual of a fire. And the second student in the scenario here is going to kind of help me to show that we're going to have some engine issues here. So he puts the fire up on the cowl to simulate an engine fire. And I'm looking for the other student to react. And if we kind of watch his hands there, you can see he just disengaged the autopilot. And looks like he's got the power back. He's starting to make some radio calls here to Miami Approach, declaring an emergency. But if you look at the horizon, he's really not descending much or anything here. So again, yep, those windows were open and those air vents were open. So now we're starting to get some smoke coming in the cabin. And we're sitting here talking on the radio back and forth. I'm Miami Center, and he's declared the emergency, and I'm just trying to get some more information. You can still see there's no emergency descent going on here. I haven't seen him reach for the fuel selector to turn that off. The mixture is off though, so no checklist out or anything like that. And these are the types of things that we don't really do well on practicing, obviously. So right now he's saying he's looking for a road to possibly land on. I offered an airport to him, but he did make the decision that he's not going to be able to continue far enough to actually make it to that airport. Turning off some electrical equipment here. Confirming the mixture's off, the throttle's back, but we're still not descending very fast here. That's a red boa I just threw on the instrument panel, so that's supposed to simulate maybe some flames coming out. And the other student kind of comments how maybe the 10-year-old and the 8-year-old in the back might be a little excited at this point and possibly screaming. So I will actually kind of act like a 10-year-old or something. Not much of a stretch for me, but you know, and add some more realism to this. So you can see now it looks like the nose is down a little further. We're trying to find something, but we're still really not doing much of an emergency descent. And as he continues here, he really hasn't addressed the vents or the windows. So as we get closer to the ground, I'll actually add a little bit more smoke in here. And then I'll adjust the visibility in the simulator, the outside visibility down, because obviously we'd have that smoke in front of us hampering our vision. And these are all things you can tweak on different scenarios, obviously. They can't all be engine fires or electrical fires or whatnot, but try to make it as realistic as you can so the student can learn from it. So you can see out here, our visibility is dropping now with all that white smoke out there. And then we'll get some more smoke inside as well. So I'm starting to run the smoke generator again, and yep, here comes more smoke. It's just kind of rolling around in there. Trying to make it as realistic as I could without, you know, actually having windows that open and air vents. There are air vents in the simulator, obviously, that they could close, but they haven't done that yet. So, and they'll continue down. I'm trying to see about how high they are. A little difficult to tell with the smoke that's in there. So here I changed the visibility. I want to give him a shot at trying to maybe make the landing. I think he finally got to the fuel selector, so we took away the fire, and now it's a power off gliding landing with still some smoke in the cabin. But it looks like he was able to find somewhere to touch down and hold it off there. So pretty decent outcome, possibly. Definitely some things that could have been done better, right? So we don't really grade the students on what happens in this scenario, right? So what do we do after the scenario is executed? The student is going to write a one-page review based on the video of their flight. So we will actually record the flight with audio and then give the students a copy of that. I want to know what went well. So maybe the flight went off without a hitch. Hopefully they can look into it and say, well, you know, this planning, you know, I don't know what might have happened poorly. You know, the flight went well. What could have been done better? So in this scenario, obviously there were a couple things that could have been done better. And then what risks did I miss on this flight? After they submit that paper online, it opens up one more assignment, and that assignment is one more paper, but this time around they get the NTSB accident number, and they'll go through the NTSB report and kind of compare and contrast what's going on between the scenario they just did in the simulator and what happened in real life in this NTSB accident. And sometimes they've performed better than the accident, sometimes it's the same outcome, but it's basically to kind of show that, yeah, these are realistic things that could happen, and we do have to plan for these type of things. Like I said, this is a college course. You could adjust it the way you want, but we don't grade the students on the life or death outcome of the simulation. That just probably wouldn't be fair, right? So we have 3 papers in the flight plan. Those are the assignments. So I put about a 15% weight on the risk management paper up front, 10% because we want them to turn in a flight plan form. The post-scenario analysis paper is kind of the biggest one there that I weight the grade on, about a 45%, and then maybe 35% on the comparison paper. And you can kind of tweak these, obviously, if you're doing a course like this. If you're just a flight instructor working with a student, you can adjust. Maybe it's one paper where they kind of talk about what happened on the scenario and compare and contrast what happens with the NTSB report, or that could just be a discussion. Maybe they don't even have to write a paper, because the whole outcome we're looking for here is, being able to see those risks before we actually end up in that situation, right? And trying to plan for extra safety nets to keep us safe. So that's pretty much my presentation. I just want to thank Redbird for the opportunity to present here. If you have any questions, that's my email there. So if you're looking at maybe implementing something like this in the future, feel free to reach out to me and maybe I can give you some pointers. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my presentation.